Hi guys, and welcome to another edition of the Kevin Moore Show. Now on today's show, I'm about to be joined by my guest, Lee Witting. Now Lee serves as a chaplain at a major Maine hospital and a pastor at the Union Street Brick Church in Bangor, Maine, USA. He's also the publications director for the International Association of Near-Death Studies. Now his interest in NDEs began as a child when he drowned in a lake near New Jersey. He now hosts the NDE radio show, which airs live every Monday. Just see the link in the description below. And Lee Witting, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Thank you for coming on. Now, you've got an interesting job right now. You're doing the same thing as I'm doing as well, which is interviewing people and releasing them on different platforms and sharing the stories of some wonderful guests. Now, a lot of the guests that you have on are obviously in the near-death experience field, which I find fascinating. I keep saying that on these interviews that I'm doing with more and more near-death experience people. I've wanted to do it for so long, to have more people on in this field. I think it's a great. To me, it's the best introduction to spirituality and knowing that you're more than your body than any other subject in this field.
Mm-hmm. One of the people I interviewed, Peter Panagore, who was a pastor who had a near-death experience, likes to say, I don't have any faith in God. I know that God exists because of his NDE. And a lot of NDEers do that. Many of them actually wind up dropping out of their churches because it's a different structure. Once you've been there and seen it, and occasionally pastors will even resent the fact that somebody in the congregation has a more direct experience of God or of Jesus than they have. And so it doesn't always work out. On the other hand, there are many NDEers who do have religious faith too.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's a whole mixture, isn't it? It really is. Now, just for people straight away to know a bit more about yourself, your website is, how can people find out more about yourself?
Well, the best way to find out is just to go to NDE Radio, and there's a profile of me, and more than 300 interviews are archived there, mostly interviews with people I've done who've had NDEs. Occasionally it's a show where I just talk about something that's on my mind. I got a doctorate in near-death experience from my seminary, and so sometimes I'll just go off on a tangent and talk about something theological.
Well, it all fits. It all fits. And, of course, so many questions right now. And as you just said there as well, going on from that thread, okay, I mean, I'm not religious myself. I would say that I'm more of an explorer. I'm more of a person that's looking at my own, the spiritual side of things, where it's you coming up with your own understanding of it rather than a single book, dictating that this is the only truth. But there's great teachers in the Bible. Do not get me wrong there.
Right. Well, as a chaplain, I just retired as a chaplain at a critical care facility in Maine, the Eastern Maine Medical Center in Bangor, Maine. And for 15 years, I saw the lists of people who belonged to different denominations, Methodists or Catholics or Jewish or what have you, diminishing. And the list, on the other hand, would say no one or none. When they ask for religious preference, and yet I could go from room to room all day long, and they'd say, "Well, I don't go to a church, but I'm spiritual." And I think that's probably where you are at too. It's that we can't, as much as we try, even atheists have a spiritual side to them. I mean, even in the denial of an afterlife, they're taking a theological stand.
Of course. No, absolutely so true. I mean, and you have seen so much. I mean, have you been around people that are passing or were on their way to crossing over?
Oh, absolutely. And I've had some amazing conversations with people. Sometimes you'll have someone who's been in a coma who, at the last minute, for an hour or two, or maybe even a day or more, will come back out of that. The family will say, my God, it's a miracle he's healed. And but no, it's what it is. It's a moment of clarity, even for people who've possibly had Alzheimer's or some sort of debilitating brain function. suddenly they're clear again. They recognize their family and they have some last words to say. Other experiences are people who see angels. There was a man not too long ago who pointed out the window and said, "Do you see that angel out there?" And I had to say, "No, I don't see him, but I believe you. I believe you're seeing him." There was a wonderful story about that a nurse told me about a man who had been in terrible pain, very, very long suffering sickness. And he said, and she went in one day and he was all bright and cheery. And she said, "Well, you seem to be much better." And he said, "Well, my brother came to visit me." She said, "Well, I thought your brother had died." And he said, "Oh, yes, he did. But he came to visit me. He said he's taking me home tomorrow at 1 o'clock. And can you be here? Can you sit with me?" She said, "Well, you're not even that sick. You're not going to die tomorrow." But she said, "Sure, I'll be with you." And so she's sitting there, and at precisely at 1 o'clock, he raised his arms, a big smile on his face, obviously saw his brother, and he was gone.
What's it like to be around someone that's crossing over? I mean, what advice can you give to those, and including myself, that will go through that one day as well with people that we love?
A lot of it has to do with the situation, and I'll tell you the story of the best death and the worst death that I attended, and I'll start with the worst because I would like to get it out of the way. So there's this man. He is in terrible pain. He was dying from cancer. They couldn't give him enough painkiller. He was just in agony and screaming, and his family was terribly upset, and everyone was screaming at each other, just carrying on. And no spiritual context to put anything in. They were just very, very angry at the whole situation. So he dies, and immediately I feel this absolute cold, nauseating feeling as his spirit tried to invade my body. And I said to the family, "I can't stay. I've got to leave." And I went out the door and around the corner, and I leaned against a wall and I said, "You can't come in here. You don't belong here. You've got to look for the light. There are beings all around you who will help you, will guide you. Just look for them." And he left. But it was such a sickening feeling that, and so I would say, number one, that's not the way to go. Now, number two, this is the best death I ever attended. This was a grandfather, a great grandfather, actually. Whole family in there just loved him to pieces. They were all saying, "We love you, and everything's going to be all right. Don't worry about us. Don't worry about a thing. We'll take care of each other." And when he finally passed, it was, well, it's what they sometimes call an attended or a near-death experience where someone almost travels with you, except I didn't travel with his soul, but it was like this honey pouring into the room, this golden light. It was viscous. It felt like it was all spiritual, of course, but it felt like a physical, like you could almost feel it. It was so tangible and so beautiful. And I just felt this love pouring down. Now, I don't know if it was directly from God or this man's guardian angel or just the materialization of the family's love. But whatever it was amazing. And that would be definitely the way to go if you had that option.
Do you think that on the first occasion that person that entered into you, do you think it was more of a thank you?
No, it was definitely I don't want to die. He was still very angry. He was just as angry when he entered me as he was before he'd left his own body.
So he had never questioned the idea that he's more than his body. His family around him really, obviously, maybe not all of them had gone through that process of, why am I here, the purpose of life.
I never had a chance to talk to him about whether
Right.
he had any theological belief, but he was so angry. I mean, if he had a belief in God, it had completely disappeared during that final death that he was going through.
And do you think that anger stopped the guys that he may have had, well, he does have, coming through with free will to him?
Oh, I think and this is where ghosts hang up. I mean, there's definitely a real world of in the in between where ghosts exist, and they are either here because they are afraid or addicted to something, a person or a place. Um, I've met people who have had out of body experiences, in fact, can do it at will, and they are like missionaries to ghosts. And they will go, for example, into a bar, and you'll see someone standing at the bar drinking, and right next to him, there's this ghost of an alcoholic lifting a pretend glass to pretend lips, trying to recapture that feeling of having your first drink and trying to get a contact high from the actual physical person who's drinking there. They go to them and they'll say, "You don't have to be here. You don't want to be here. You're stuck here, but you don't have to be. And just look for the light. Look for a guardian angel. Look for a relative who would like to help you." Apparently, we can often be blind when we go over there until we look around. And that's sort of a purgatory, to put it in Catholic terms, where you're stuck in this plane, maybe addicted to a house, to a family, to someone who had never unrequited love. There was a woman who talked to me about how she had felt followed by this ghost, and just everywhere she went, at home, she felt his presence was there. Finally, she ran up his obituary on her computer and read it to him. And after that, he was gone. Then he realized he was dead.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And have you come across stories where people have crossed over and it's almost like they're in a void of blackness? They don't know where they are. That it's almost a creation of their own creation, in a sense.
Yeah, there are hells of our own making. They're called DNDEs, or distressing near-death experiences. And one was described to me as it felt like he was being closed in a clamshell, that he was being cut off from all other beings, from all sources of love, from light. And it was just dark, and he felt this thing closing. It was probably analogous to a coffin, but he saw it as a clamshell, and he was inside, and this top was coming down on him, and he was scared to death. And but those are unusual. For the most part, they're very positive near-death experiences, and I'm just as interested in the others because I think near-death experience is a very personal message. It's a gift given to you to teach you something. And if it's negative, then it's important that you learn whatever that lesson is. He said after he came back, he was much more generous and loving with his family and his friends than he'd ever been before. It was like Scrooge being reborn.
and maybe that's the 10 by 4 that person needed hitting with to get to that level. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
And whether that's, I mean, do we call it something above us, that something, that's greater than us, wanting to get that message? Or is it our soul screaming at us saying, hey, come on, wait, this is your time to wake up now. We don't need to go through another lifetime of having some of the same issues. We can heal these.
Well, oftentimes, I mean, I have heard enough stories about reincarnation and memories in children from past lives that I firmly believe we have that option to reincarnate if we want to. And yeah, there are situations, as far back as Plato, there was a beautiful description of a near-death experience in Plato's Republic. A soldier dies. He's 10 days. His body's carried back, and they're going to burn his body on a pyre. Suddenly, he sits up and he says, "I've been sent back to tell you what happens when we die." He said, "I was killed, and I was crossing this field with my fellow soldiers who'd also been killed in this battle." And he said, and then we came to a place of judgment, and some people went up to their reward, and some went down for a temporary punishment. And after all of that had happened, the two groups met together in a big field, and told one another what had happened to them and what they'd gone through and everything. And then they went to a river of forgetfulness. They drank from the river of forgetfulness, and then they were reincarnated. And the way they were chosen, the life that was chosen for them, was partly of their choice and partly assigned to them. It was fate. It was a toss of the dice. So they would say, for instance, I want to be a king, or I want to be a rich person, or I want to be a poor person to learn something that I didn't learn in my past life. And so that part of it you might get, but on the other hand, the circumstances, all those infinite circumstances, were roll of the dice, and you just wound up where you wound up. So
Yeah,
that's Plato's take on it, but it works for me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we're going to get back to some of the things you were just saying. Just going to move this forward, and then we'll go back to just, when I, you having done all the interviews that you've done, right? Do you still really understand what this is all about? Why are we here? What's your take on that?
I think we're here to learn love. I think we are, years ago, before I even got interested in going to the seminary, although I'd always been interested in theological things. I was burning a big pile of brush. We had a farmhouse in Maine, and I was clearing a field, and I built this huge stack of alders, and I was setting it off, and it was getting close to dark, and the huge fire that was burning in the middle of this thing was sending out hundreds of sparks. And I thought to myself, that's just like what we are. There's a source, which is the fire, and where are the sparks that are flying off in all directions. And we have the choice to either learn what it is that fires the fire and rejoin it ultimately, or we can just go off and get burned out and disappear. And I think that's what it's about. The fire being love. We are here to learn how to love one another and take care of one another. That whole parable that Jesus tells about the sheep and the goats, which is the final judgment. This is the end times judgment Jesus describes. He says, "Oh, you blessed, basically, thank you for feeding me when I was hungry, and clothing me when I was poor, and sheltering me and taking care of me when I was sick, and visiting me in prison." And they all say, the sheep all say, "Well, when did we do that?" And he said, "Whenever you did it for the least of my people, or anybody, the least of anybody," because he always said, when he was asked who is my neighbor, he implied with a Good Samaritan story that everyone's your neighbor. Anyway, he said, so you are all blessed, and you're going to heaven, basically. And then to the goats, he said, "I was thirsty, and you never gave me anything to drink. I was hungry, and you never fed me." And so they had not learned love. They had not learned how to share. And so here they're condemned. And that's like the final judgment. Now, my take on the intermediate vision, which many people have when they get extensively into their near-death experience. Well, typically, shall I describe a typical near-death experience? Okay, well, I was just about to tell you what a typical happy near-death experience is. But it doesn't do justice to every individual's near-death experience, because everyone is different. But basically what happens is the body dies, the heart stops, maybe you're on the operating table. The soul rises up out of the body, is often confused, doesn't understand what's going on, looks around the room, sees a body down below. Typically you go up to the ceiling, or to the corner of the room up by the ceiling, and you'll see the doctors trying to start your heart or whatever is going on. Then if you progress, you leave the room, you may go through a wall, you may hear your family talking about your medical situation if you're in the hospital. Some people will hear conversations, and there's something called veridical evidence, which is evidence that these things are real. And one would be like grandma who had hadn't smoked in years is so upset that she decides to leave the waiting room and go outside and smoke a cigarette. Well, there's no way the a patient dead on the table would know about that unless their soul had witnessed that. Another person recently told me about a phone conversation they'd had where they could hear it was a wife whose husband was on the phone, and she could hear his what he had to say. And then when her good friend on the other end of the line was talking, she was suddenly with her other friend and right with her, listening to her side of the conversation. Anyway, from there, you might move on. You might go into, they talk about a tunnel. You can be accompanied or unaccompanied. There might be an angel with you, or a spirit of some sort, or you may just travel by yourself. And then you go into a beautiful field or woods. You may see family, deceased members of family. Sometimes people see a beautiful city in the distance. And at some point, you may wind up talking to a spiritual figure in your life. Jesus, for example, is often part of these stories. And then you're told, it's not your time yet. You have to go back. Sometimes you're given a choice. Sometimes you're told you have to go back. Sometimes it's you're given a choice, but you so much want to stay that they show you how your family is suffering, your children are unhappy, who's going to care for them, and then you make the decision that they're trying to sell to you to go back. Okay, so that's your typical happy near-death experience. And I can't remember what your question was that provoked that description in the first place.
Well, it actually, do you know what? What you've said there is fantastic anyway, so don't worry, I've got so many questions. Actually, just getting back to something we were talking about earlier on, in the sense where the gentleman that passed away, where it wasn't a good crossing. I'm just interested in that as well. It's he was met in the end by someone. He would have he would have crossed over at some point. But what are the advantages, do you think, of help? How can you help yourself to make sure that you have a good crossing over in this lifetime? No matter what you've done, because I mean, we could have done all sorts of bloody things. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
And you have to get to a point where you're going to forgive yourself of those things and move on, no matter what it is, right?
Right.
So based on someone like that gentleman, what could he have done that could have, created something a little bit easier for him?
Wow, it's hard to say where to start on something like that, because his problems might have been as a result of being abused as a child and having a horrible life as a result of that. But what we can do is exactly what the Lord's Prayer asks us to do, which is to forgive one another, which is part of loving one another. Even if we have done terrible things in our life, what we want to do is, again, like Charles Dickens' Scrooge, we want to reform. We want to be better people, kinder people, more loving people. If we practice love, we are putting ourselves much more in alignment with what God is all about than if we just go, figure, oh, well, God is merciful, he'll forgive me, or I'm totally condemned. I'm screwed. There's nothing I can do to save my soul at this point. Neither of those are valid arguments. I mean, there are parables that say God is waiting for deathbed conversions. He's waiting for some sign from you. And even those people who say, well, if you don't do it in this lifetime, you don't stand a chance. There are cases where people who denied the possibility of an afterlife or denied the possibility of a God, when they come into the presence of God or of Jesus or whoever, or of an angel or angels, they suddenly realize what the truth is, and just by acknowledging the truth at that point, see, they have taken a much bigger step than that guy who tried to invade my body did. They're forgiven. I mean, the thing about near-death experience and combined with reincarnation is we get chance after chance. We can, if we screw up in this life, we can hopefully do it better in the next life.
But that's not an excuse, is it? That you're saying there, that's not an excuse not to try your best here right now. Even at any stage of your life, just even if that trying is loving yourself more, because if you can love yourself more, surely then you can, emanate that to other people.
Mm. The trouble with loving yourself, though, is our egos and our defense mechanisms play such a big part in the notion that we love ourselves that we can be lying to ourselves. I mean, our current president is a perfect example of all ego and no self-awareness. And to really love yourself, you have to be self-aware. You have to see yourself in relationship to other people. We can't even understand ourselves unless we see the way we interact with other people. And if all we want is for other people to adore us all the time, we will never have the capacity to really love ourselves the way you intend that phrase to be.
Well, where do you start then? Where is the starting point, do you think, after all the experience that you've had? Do you think it's to explore the idea that we're more than just this body? Does it start there?
Well, yes, I think we all know that in one level or another. Yes, we have a soul, but we don't even have to believe that. I think what we have to do is define ourselves in relationship to other people. And how we deal with other people is how we come to understand ourselves. And if we feed the hungry, and you don't have to be madly in love with everyone who asks you for a buck, but you just have to be open to it. You have to figure, even if that guy on the corner has conned $100 a day out of people asking them for money, give him $1, because that is for your benefit as well as for his or hers.
Well, then, what is the difference between that action and being of service then?
None. You should be of service all the time. Not necessarily meaning that you have to quit your day job and go out and work at a homeless shelter, but you have to be willing to you have to be willing to do what you're called to do, either by others or by yourself. If you feel that impulse to work in a homeless shelter and you just happen to be a stockbroker making $250,000 a year, but that's the impulse you're called to follow, bank your money and then go work at the homeless shelter.
Okay, absolutely. But okay, so how has all the interviews that you've been doing changed you as a person?
Well, I must say, I've had the advantage of having a near-death experience myself. So that probably was the greatest revelation. When I was 7 years old, I drowned in a lake. My father had come back from the war, and he'd seen a lot of tough things in the war, and he wanted a place to go. So he built this little cabin on an island in New Jersey, on a little lake. And one day he was off in town. My mother had just gone into the cottage to change her clothes, I think. And I didn't know how to swim. I was 7, and I waded out too far. And what happened was the lake went out on a fairly level basis and then dropped right off. So I stepped off, and I came up once, and I screamed for my mother. Fortunately, she heard me. And then because I'd screamed all the air out of my lungs, I sank to the bottom of the lake. But all of a sudden, my soul was up in a birch tree, watching my mother run down to the shore, came out of the cottage and down the steps and ran to the shore, dove in. She knew about where I was, hauled me out, threw me face down over a log, and pumped on my back. She said later she was trying to get the water out of my lungs. But in the meantime, I'm watching this whole thing from up above. I saw there was a place I could go, but I also saw that my mother was very upset, so I figured I better hang around, and then I was back in my body. So, there's the thing about faith is, like I said earlier, you can have faith or you can know. Well, at that point I knew. And so that gives you a tremendous advantage. Although secondhand stories of near-death experience, are almost as good. When I was working as a chaplain, people would tell me these things that had happened to them. One woman, for instance, she'd coded. I always went in to see the people who'd coded and say, well, what did you see when you were on the other side? And for the most part, they would say nothing. They couldn't remember anything. But 15% perhaps would say, oh, I saw my dad, or I saw an angel, or I saw Jesus. I had a conversation with Jesus and he told me it wasn't my time and I had to go back. So this one woman, she said, she was in her mid 50s, maybe early 60s. She coded, and I asked her that question. What happened did you see anything on the other side? She said, yes, I saw my father. She was so happy that I'd asked her because she didn't know how she was going to tell anybody about this. She said, I saw my father, and I saw behind him, I saw this beautiful light. She said, and I wanted to go into the light. And she said, suddenly I was like a little girl trying to run around my dad, get past him to go into the light. But he stopped me and he said, no, it's not your time. And he sent me back. But she said it was such a gift to see him there that she had no doubt at all about one of the characteristics of near-death experiencers, if they've had a good experience, is they're no longer afraid of dying. And that was the gift that she'd been given in that.
Yeah, it's just, and there's so many different scenarios that people that have had this experience go through. And I guess sometimes, those that have had a near-death experience don't always validate what they've had or can't validate it. And it kind of remains hidden sometimes. And, do they ever really refer back to it because it was just something so out of the ordinary?
Well, it depends on if it changes your life. I think they do refer back to it more often. If they just come back and the doctor says you just hallucinated that was the anesthesia affecting your brain, and you start to tell your wife or your priest or your pastor, and they say, oh, that I don't believe that, then you're kind of shut down, and so you're discouraged by it. And even if it looked realer than real to you, and you absolutely believe that it was true at the time, you can be talked out of it. On the other hand, if you're encouraged about it and you read other stories, or like me, do a radio show where I hear a story a week for the most part, it is very reaffirming. It's incredibly powerful. And IANDS, the group that I do this show for, International Association for Near-Death Studies, and other groups like that, have conferences. We're having an annual conference outside of Philadelphia later in August. And when you get together in a room with a bunch of people who've had that kind of experience, it can be very powerful. You can feel the energy in the place, unlike taking a ride on the subway in New York, for instance.
Or a conspiracy conference.
Yes, right, where everyone's paranoid.
Yeah, the government is out to get me. No, absolutely. So with your near-death experience, how did your parents take that story from you? Did you ever tell them until you were a bit older, or?
No, I never, not right away. And I thought at the time that it would upset my mother. In fact, my whole drowning upset her. She converted to Catholicism as a result, which meant that all the kids had to become Catholics, which meant I wound up going from what was a Presbyterian Sunday school, which was mainly coloring books and doing, coloring in Jesus and that sort of thing. Suddenly I had to memorize a catechism that was, little beyond my interests. And if you didn't know your lesson, the nun would come along with a ruler and whack you on the back of the hand. So it was a different take on religion than I'd ever had before. But I was fascinated. After that, a lot of my interests changed. I was interested in astronomy, and I wanted to, more than anything, I wanted my mother not to take me to church, but to take me to the Hayden Planetarium in New York, because I loved the shows that they put on. And finally, after a while, I got a little toy planetarium projector that they sold at the Hayden Planetarium and built a whole planetarium in our attic. Took over a room. I had skylines cut out of cardboard and sunsets and sunrises, and I designed shows and ways to do a flash of light like a comet striking the Earth. And I'd get my mother to come up, and I had a mattress on the floor, and she'd lie there, and I'd do my show for her. She bought me a telescope. I spent hours out in the backyard looking at the moon and the moons of Jupiter and the rings of Saturn. And then when I got to college, I was really interested in Eastern religion. I studied Buddhism. And so anyway, I think probably all of that came as a change in direction at age 7 after drowning.
And when you left your body, I mean, did you feel that unconditional love that was wrapped around you?
No, I didn't. I felt everything was the way it was supposed to be. I didn't feel shocked or surprised, but I was young. See, I think I probably had some residual memory of where I'd come from in the beginning. And so, no, it all seemed just the way it was supposed to be. And, I wasn't surprised to know that I was a soul, and that I had this capacity to go on after my body died. It just, it all seemed natural. So when I was back in my body, well, it hurt. I mean, when you go back into your body, that's one of the dramatic things about being out of it, because you see yourself as the way you see yourself. You see yourself in your body, but there's no pain. And when you've been out of your body even for a minute, you realize how much pain we endure all the time. We have chemicals our brain produces to stop a lot of the residual hurting that just goes on all the time. But it's amazing when you're free of your body. You're really free.
Absolutely, you are. And did you have any other siblings, or?
Yes, in fact, my sister, who's 4 years younger, I have 2 sisters and a younger brother, but my sister Anne had another really interesting experience on that same island when she was. I was older, and I think she was probably 6 or 7 herself, and she was playing. She's just in the grass playing, and she saw a fairy. She saw this little, foot tall being. It was just sort of walking by, and all of a sudden, she said, the fairy realized that I could see her. I think she describes it as her, and was totally shocked and ran off. But just one little. My feeling is that we're all entitled to at least one unexplainable mystical experience in our lives. Everyone should have one of those, and so that was hers. But it makes a difference.
Of course it does. And how do they take what you're doing now with this radio show? Has it been of interest to them to know what you're up to, and have they been sort of on their own path?
Yes. Very different paths. My sister was my Anne was a Quaker. I was also a member of the Society of Friends, the Quakers, for a while, especially during war protests, when we were protesting Vietnam. And my younger sister she listens to the show. I think she's interested in it. And my brother, who owns Talk Zone, which is the company that produces my show, that's his company. So he's interested in it too, although his interests are more in a spiritual leader named Yogananda, and there are Yogananda institutes around. He lives in Texas. There's one in outside of Dallas that he attends. But yeah, I think we're all kind of interested in those things, and that probably was because of my mother, who was very spiritual. She, she did become a Catholic. She had some problems with the Catholic Church after she was a Catholic, but I mean, God must have welcomed her with open arms. She put up with my dad. She put up with us, and she put up with. She was a very empathetic person. She put up with a lot of other people's suffering too. So, yeah.
with the near-death experience, of course, everyone's got a different take on it. What I mean is that those have had experienced the near-death, and one thing they also some of them that they say that they have in common is the aspect of the survivor of the near-death experience, in the sense that there is a survivor kind of mentality sometimes where they feel so isolated, so on their own, and they can't share it with anyone, and they just really wish they could go back to that space, but it really wasn't their time. They were sent back to share this message, weren't they?
Yes. There's one fellow, I won't mention his name even though he's written books about it, who was in a terrible auto accident in Nevada, I think it took place. And he lost his kids. His wife died. And he was out of his body and watched his wife's soul leaving. And she told him, you have to stay. I guess one child survived. And she said, you have to stay and be with him. And then he was back in his body. And his experience in the hospital was there was an infant that died. And he, as his soul left his body, traveled down the hallway and found a crib containing the soul of his little child. He was able to hold that child one last time before it departed. He has talked about this and written books about it, and has probably moved many, many people in a more spiritual direction.
I mean, isn't that just amazing, just to be able to share that story and to see someone that's come out the other side of something as horrific as that and gone on to do such great things as well, which a lot of the survivors do of such things. But one of my questions was, just leading up to this, was obviously everyone has a different take on the near-death experience, and some people, a lot of people, they'll say that they met their loved ones, or some say that they met Jesus or whatever religious figure that they're sort of not attached to, but they're working with in life, with their spiritual journey. But I wonder if any of that is true, in the sense that, do we create the reality that we want to create that's pleasing to us as we first cross over? And is there another larger reality beyond, that which we think is the only truth?
Well, a lot of near-death experiencers think that it's a very simple story about God is all love, and so no one can do so much wrong that they're not forgiven. The Bible talks about two judgments. One is the judgment that I take to be the one that passes, that you pass through when you have a near-death experience. And that first judgment, and every judgment, as you reincarnate and die and go back again, is that it's a little like the story from Plato that I told you, but instead of being punished or rewarded right then, you get a life review. And they say, some people have described it as like a three-dimensional, 360-degree screen of your whole life. And how you experience it is, if you've hurt someone or you've benefited someone, you feel the hurt that you caused from the other person's point of view. In other words, you're wearing their shoes when you hurt them, and you understand exactly what damage you might have done. And so when you talk about forgiving yourself, it's harder to do that when you are feeling from the other person's point of view what you did. But anyway, people seem to go through that and seem to feel like they have survived it and that they're forgiven, and they go on, and maybe they stay, or maybe they go into another life. But the second judgment, the end times judgment that Jesus describes in the Bible, is the one I mentioned about the sheep and the goats. And at that point in time, it's like a dividing up, and okay, you guys learned what love was all about. You deserve to live with love. And you guys didn't figure it out, had many chances to figure it out, never did. You're not part of the group anymore. And then they're outcasts. And so that's just a theological thing. It's called the white throne judgment. It's described in Revelation, but it's best described by Jesus in that sheep and goats story. And it gives you the easiest answer in the world, and that is just to be kind to one another. If you can just do that, you're okay.
But surely a life review is maybe equivalent to going to hell. If I don't believe in hell, but I mean, if you've got to feel the pain, or you have to, I'm guessing there might be free will involved in the life review. Let me just add that. But if you do want to go through with that free will and experience the life review, that would be an equivalent of something harsh to me. Having to, feel the joy and the pain of that which you did to others. Do you believe there's free will maybe in the life review?
I think the life review is given to you as a gift to see the way you lived your life. Your free will was exercised when you chose to either help or harm the other person. And now you understand the consequences. But that's not a final judgment. That just means, okay, did you get it this time? And if you got it this time, then you'll live your next life better. The karma goes on, but it doesn't. It's not like Marley's ghost and the chains that he's dragging. It's something that you can free yourself with at every life review. And if we've lived 100 times, well, we've probably had 100 life reviews. But that final end times judgment is the one where it's all summarized. See, it's not fair to have just one life. That's one of my reasons for believing in reincarnation. It's not fair that you would. What if you're born a poor kid and picking scraps off the dumps in Cairo, Egypt, versus somebody who's been given everything we've been given to enjoy in America, for instance? I mean, a very comparatively wealthy situation. So maybe we have to spend our time as a black or as a poor kid in a poor country, or we all have to take our turns going through every confluence of life in order to be able to be judged.
Well. You just said it there. We all have to go through everything. So maybe the soul is like, Geronimo, let me get that life as that kid on the streets of Cairo. Let me experience that, because it's not seeing the picture that we see. It's seeing the much more expansive picture of
Right.
what it's going to get out of that experience. It's not seeing the suffering. It's seeing the growth that it would get from that.
Right. Right. And, Jesus always, he hung out with the poor and the lame, and he healed where he could. Sometimes he couldn't, but he made his home with not with the privileged, but with the underprivileged.
Yeah, yeah.
That's where the love is needed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, what if, obviously, the near-death experience is not just a teacher for those that have the experience. It's a message for everyone else as well. But what is the most important message of the near-death experience, would you say?
That our souls go on, that the materialist values that we grew up thinking are the most important things, that we're, as little kids, we aren't born into a world thinking that, but we're taught that. Society teaches that success is the most important thing, and success is measured by your material wealth and how much money you have in the bank and so forth. But the near-death experience says, no, that's all wrong. That's not where it's at. And there have been polls taken, and in this country alone, in the United States alone, there are something like over 700 near-death experiences every day. 700 is a lot of people. If everyone decided, I'm going to write a book about my near-death experience, that's all you'd see the publishers publishing, because there'd be so many of them. But if everyone who'd had a near-death experience would get out there and tell 10 other people about what they experienced, what they saw, what they learned, man, we could change the world. We could make this a much more spiritual place and a kinder place to live.
Well, again, I say, right, and thank you for that. Thank you so much. Again, I say, what are some of the key messages that these people are bringing from the other side into this present moment now that can help our life improve in ways that we couldn't even imagine? Is that being of service to others? Is that it's okay to make a lot of money, but do it from the perspective where it's going to be of service to others with what you're doing, right? And if what you do is what you do and it's of service, then it should generate what you want it to do. We come from the wrong perspective, but I don't want to take over this. You obviously add what you need to add to that as well.
Well, I think because these near-death experiences are so personalized, that different people learn different things, and it probably depends on. It's a gift. It's definitely a gift. Even a distressing near-death experience is a gift because it teaches you, one, that life goes on after you die, and two, that if you're being told you're isolated from the rest of the world, you're doing it to yourself. I mean, I think if there is a hell, it's probably our putting ourselves there because we feel so unworthy and so rotted, rotten to the core. Some people just feel so unworthy that they just cannot justify God's love. They can't bring themselves to accept it. And, it's there if you can accept it, but you have to teach yourself how to really accept it by teaching yourself how to love other people. I mean, it's a give and take.
Would you be surprised that when you cross over, that it's so much more expansive than any single book has ever put out there, that the real understanding of what it's all about is so much bigger, much, much bigger?
Oh, yeah. There have been people who've had, one woman who had a epileptic seizure. She said while her brain was, electricity was just running through her brain and zapping all her rational abilities, she said, I had the answer to every question I'd ever asked. And a lot of people have come back from near-death experiences saying that same thing. Everything I ever wondered about, suddenly I understood. It's like we are part of the collective consciousness of the world, and that consciousness infuses everything is another impulse. One guy who was out of his body said he ran into a desk and he could feel the consciousness of the wood in the desk as he ran into it, that it was, or passed through it, maybe passed through it. And but he said everything is God consciousness, and if this is all a part of God's creation, then that makes perfect sense to me.
Well, what is not God?
Yeah. Just the absence of love, I suppose. But I think.
But if a desk is conscious, what is not God?
Well, that's right. That's right. Because the capacity is there. There is nothing that's not God.
There is nothing, and is God just? I mean, I always say, no disrespect to anyone, but God is just a word. It's just dog spelled backwards. It's a word to encompass something that is us. It's not separate from us, this energy. It is us. I mean, can you go down that road that it's not so separate?
Yes. Well, I think one of the things that Jesus gets credit for is bringing the Holy Spirit into the world, and that it was always there, that it's sort of God reaching out. It's sort of the love energy reaching down to you. And if you feel in touch with things, as I think enlightened Buddhists do, for instance, it's or have a deep understanding of the chi energy that they talk about in Oriental religions. That is like it's God's breath. It's the breath of life, and it infuses everything. It infuses us as individuals. And if you see it that way, and you see other people that way, then it's so easy to identify with them and be part of them, because you are part of them.
Absolutely. And if only with the people, our enemies, the people that we've fallen out with, the people in our family. What about the family? Is the greatest way to teach this, isn't it? That our families can be our greatest teachers, where we can apply what you just said there to those that we may not always appreciate, and just see the best in someone, and see that is God, that is an aspect of the divine that we're with, and that we to see it so separately sometimes as that person's bad or this is that. It's not so clear cut as that. We could come from a different space overnight if we just saw that and just treat each other with more love.
Exactly. Well, the basis of all great novels is, that moment of forgiveness when people are reconciled to each other. You go to a movie and people who've been hitting at each other, in the story or in real life, suddenly can find it in their hearts to understand and forgive, which is like the basis of love. Is just whatever you did to me, it's okay because I love you. It's so intrinsic to healing and to our communion with God, that's where it's at. And if we just forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, is the way the Lord's Prayer puts it. But there are lots of ways of putting it, but that's what it comes down to.
Absolutely. And I think another thing that the near-death experience has taught me, just from doing these interviews more recently, and my own experiences, is that, yes, okay, so we continue, we're forever, but we chose to be here, so be here. Don't get too lost in where we're going and what it's all about. Yes, it's all very interesting and it can help because we're talking about bringing information from that realm into the present moment to make this better, right? But we chose to be here, so be here and make the most of it.
And maybe we're just extensions of God trying to figure out what the creation is all about that he made. It's like the difference between the Old Testament and the New Testament, where God is, these are my people, and we're going to go to war with the Egyptians over there or whoever. And then Jesus comes into the world as like an extension, holding an olive branch, suffers, gets whipped, gets crucified, and on the cross he says, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," and just brings that so much love as a result of that. Now, Christianity's botched the whole thing. I mean, Christianity has a way of screwing things up that you wouldn't believe, but Jesus didn't. And if you can get
the original teachings of Jesus, I agree with you.
If you can get through the corruption of priests and pastors and congregations that say you can't come in here because you're not dressed the right way, or you're the wrong color, or the whatever, that religion is a bunch of rules that should never have been written in the first place. But love is such a simple and basic idea that if you've got it, you don't even need a religion. It's nice to know about Jesus and understand what he was about. But I don't even think that's necessary.
Imagine a religion where you have an empty book and you put your truth in that empty book as you grow up and as you grow in your life, but only put the truth in there if it comes from love. Imagine a book like that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we could fill it up with love, and hopefully there wouldn't be huge blank pages where we weren't doing what our capacity, should have us to,
Absolutely. Now, just remind us again, where can people find you, Lee?
NDE for near-death experience, NDE Radio, and it's also, if you go to Talk Zone, which is the company that produces it, you'll find me there, or Lee Witting, probably it will turn up on the, if you, in a Google search.
Yeah. Well, there's so much more I could have asked you, and I know I was only meant to do this for 50 minutes, and we had technical problems to begin with. And thank you for going over time with us. I really do appreciate that, Lee. And I thank you for what you're doing with your show, because there are people that you're helping that you will never meet, you'll never know of, but you touch their lives by sharing other people's stories. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be on your show.